Kitty Ryerson, and today is September 26, 1992, and many of the descendants of Ella and P.A. Martineau are gathered here in Cincinnati, Ohio, through the generosity and hard work of Jeff and Sue Cow. And we're here to hear some of the family stories, as told by my grandmother, Elinor Martineau Coyle, who has entertained all of us ever since we were little children with the wonderful stories. So with that, I'll turn it over to grandmother.
Thank you, Kitty. It is a great pleasure to be here today, and I am so pleased, and I thank you again, both Jeff and Sue, for making this opportunity possible. I do seem to be the keeper of the family stories at any rate. Apparently, I listen more than some of the other members of the family, and so when I've kind of, what would you call me, the matriarch of the family. I go to the family weddings, I go to the family funerals. I've tried to catch up with the family, and so when I've been with and talked to the various descendants, they haven't known these stories. They really haven't known very much about their early history, and it is a colorful group of people, and we can't possibly do it all. It's absolutely impossible, because it all goes back. Really, most of our ancestors, at least Ella's ancestors, were here by the early 1600s, and P.A.'s ancestors were up in Canada by 1640. So it does go a long ways back, but I'm going to take it up with the Revolutionary time. This is the first slide that we're going to get into, and you know what? That's not so bad, really, if you can go back to Revolutionary time. So it is just a gathering, a smattering of some of the family stories that have come down. My father was, Pierre, was a great raconteur, and his grandmother was a great raconteur. Maybe it's a gene in the family. You know, some families they can sing, and some families they can play the violin. In our family, we seem to tell stories. So I have gotten together some slides of the family over the years, and that's what I'm going to talk about right now in Revolutionary times. And this is a little church in Thetford, Vermont, where Tabitha Burgoyne was married to Zenas Bird she also was baptized in that church too in 1782, and then she and Zenas were married in this church in 1799. And it's a darling little church in this sort of a crossroads in Vermont where her family were living at the time. And it was most extraordinary. You know, sometimes you feel these things are planned. Charlie and I were on a genealogy trip in the East. He was looking up some of his relatives, and we finally got over to Thetford. And I didn't know at that time really anything about the early family history. I was just beginning to be interested in it, at least this early part. And we went into this little town of Thetford. It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and we saw this little church up on the green. And if you know anything about small-town country churches, they're almost always just closed up tighter than a drum as soon as the services are over. So I went into but the door was open, and I went in. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I went in, and I called, "Yoo-hoo, yoo-hoo, anybody here?" And sure enough, out comes the minister, and he introduced himself, and I introduced myself, and he said, "I don't know too much about it." But he did get out the church records, and sure enough, we found Zenas and Tabitha's wedding on that date. Really gave you a very peculiar feeling to see the handwriting of these people from that long ago. And then we took this picture of me in the sanctuary, and I like to picture this young couple before this little altar being married, exchanging their vows that long ago. And then he said that there's a township historian. In Vermont, they have these historians. And as I say, thinking about it was being planned. So he told us how to find the place, and we went over there and drove in his driveway, and this car followed us in, and he was just returning from a weekend trip. So there we had that lovely coincidence, too. And he did have a lot of early history about the family. He took me up, and he showed me he took us up and showed us where the Burgoyne homestead had been when they had lived there. Tabitha's father was a Tory. He'd come over here with the British forces and been a physician. He was captured at the Battle of Saratoga, and his jailer was a man by the name of Oliver Rice, who is the ancestor of all of you being here, who I might add lived to be over 100 years old. So think about those good genes. But at any rate, he was the jailer of Burgoyne, and Anna used to bring him, so the story goes, his food. And the two of them met and fell in love, and he deserted from the British Army, and they were married and lived in this little town of Thetford for a long time. Now, he died, Zenas, we're talking about Tabitha's husband at this point, he died in Munford, New York. They apparently had migrated to Munford, New York, and he died. They had 13 children in a relatively short space of time, and he died and left her with all 13. And at this time, there was the opening up of the West. You know, the Northwest Treaty had been signed, and so all this country was being opened up. And so they decided to migrate to Wisconsin. And her oldest son, Augustus Bird, had already been out there. He had a contract with what was to be the state of Wisconsin. At that time, it was still a territory, to build a state capitol. So they got in what I suppose like was a Conestoga wagon and made their way out to Sun Prairie, Wisconsin. Now the story goes that they got to this little area, and it was nightfall, and they got out of their wagons, they made their campfires, they settled down for the night, and they woke up in the morning, and the sun was coming up over the prairie. And Tabitha looked out, and she said, "I know a good name for this place, Sun Prairie." And so she named it then, and so it has ever been ever since. And it now is just a little suburb of Madison. It's 12 miles from what was then the center of Madison, and the story goes that Charles Bird, her son, isn't he a beauty? I'm glad none of us inherited his looks. He's my mother's grandfather, as a matter of fact. But the story is that he used to walk into Madison once a week, 12 miles, and then 12 miles back to work on the state capitol. He married a woman by the name of Lavinia Brayton, who also, anybody who was interested in the family genealogy, is a family that was over here by the 1640s. And she was supposed to have been the first, she was not supposed to be, she was the first school teacher, she and her sister, in Madison, what was the town of Madison. And she married Charlie Bird, and her sister married one of the Mansfields, who later on became the Mansfield Roofing Company. A great deal of money there. And that family connection was kept up for a long, long time. And even when one of the Mansfield girls, Estelle, married Count Bernadotte of the Swedish royalty, Nanny Bird had this wedding invitation of which she was very proud. But she died Lavinia died at a relatively early age and left a young family, and her husband remarried, and as in all families, there was a lot of fighting about who gets what. So in the end, my mother inherited none of the old family treasures, the family furniture. It all went to the second wife's family. This was Lavinia and Charles' son, James Bird, my mother's father, James Dwayne Bird. He fought in the Civil War, and the story has always come down. Now, a lot of these things are really sort of hard to authenticate, but the story has always come down that he was taken prisoner by the Confederates and briefly imprisoned, but that short period of time, the conditions in the prison were so terrible that it brought about the conditions from which he eventually died not too many years later. This is Mary Carmichael Bird, his wife. This is Nanny Bird. Any of you who are in the audience know a lot of stories about Nanny Bird and how she didn't like my mother's children. She was an awful grandmother. I shouldn't introduce her that way. That's really not fair, because she was a pretty young girl. Her mother and father was George Carmichael, and her mother was Sarah Allen Carmichael. And there again, the tradition has always been that Sarah's father was a nephew of the famous Ethan Allen, and I believe there is some substance to the story. She was a very pretty young girl and a very spoiled young lady, as I presume. Her father was quite well-to-do. She was an only child, and she married what was then the catch of Sun Prairie, James Bird, the father of the founder of Sun Prairie. Now, this was the house that George and Sarah Carmichael built. They came out to Wisconsin. They were married in 1844, and when Charles and I were on this trip to New York that I talked about a few minutes ago, we actually found the farm of George Carmichael's father and the farm of Sarah's father, and they were adjoining, and so a romance sprung up between the young people. They were married in 1844. They came out by the canal boats and got to Milwaukee, and he boarded Sarah there, and he walked out trying to find some property, and he eventually came to what was then Sun Prairie. It was just beginning to be founded, and hardly anybody was there. And he chose some very rich land, and he and his wife built this house in 1848, yes. And it's still standing. If anybody wants to go to what's the Sun Prairie, the house is still there. It's been restored, and quite a handsome place. But in 1848, you know, that must have been really quite a mansion out on the prairies of Wisconsin. Standing in front of it, oh, the one other thing I should tell you, that when they built that in 1848, they actually had a stockade around it to keep out the Indians. It's hard to realize, isn't it? And their daughter, Mary, was born here in 1848, and that is she, in her older years, of course, standing in front of it. This is my father's father. This is Antoine Martineau, who came down from Canada. My father, it took me a long time to realize that my father was a first-generation American. His father had come from Canada, and his mother came from Cuba, but her father came from Paris, France. Her mother came from Santo Domingo. And that's a long and very fascinating story, and I don't suppose in the length of this tape that I'm doing we'll really have time to tell it all. But Antoine Martineau had come down from Canada. His family were very early settlers. The earliest we go back to is 65 with a marriage. He came down to Ocado, and I don't know really much about what he did. He was in the lumber business. But what horrifies me in thinking about it, this young woman he married, she was 17 years old when they were married, and he was well along. He was about 25 or 6 years older than she. Now I don't think you'd even permit such a marriage as that. But in those days, it was fairly common because a man had to be established and able to support a family before he was able to be married. There are no pictures of his wife, Elinor Burgoyne, and so I think this is probably as good a time as any to tell you a little bit about her background. Her father's father, the story has always gone, was an aide-de-camp of Napoleon. And I believe this is true. At least he had some kind of an important position. He was not a marshal. He probably wasn't even a general, but he may have been, he had a rank in Napoleon's army. There's no question about that. His wife had died from the shock of thinking that he had been killed in one of Napoleon's campaigns, and he came back and appeared at the door, and the story always was that she fell over dead from the shock. He had this young boy, Pierre, my father's grandfather, and he brought the boy up, and apparently the lap of luxury. There was a great deal of money made by Napoleon's officers, largely from looting. As you know, that was the custom in those days. That's what drew them into a lot of these campaigns, was the opportunity to loot. He had arranged a marriage for Pierre, and Pierre was violently opposed to it. So he made his way to the New World. He was coming over to see an uncle of his who lived in Santo Domingo, had a plantation in Santo Domingo. He was shipwrecked and on an uninhabited island, but he finally made his way to Cuba. And there he met a young girl by the name of Angelique Girard, whose father had been a friend of this uncle that he was going to come to see. And the young people fell in love and were married. He went back to France. My grandmother, Elinor, was taken back to France with him to try to effect a reconciliation with his father, and apparently there was still a more bitter quarrel. They came back to Cuba. They migrated to Charleston, and they put up almost everything that they had left to get passage for themselves and now a considerable number of children. They landed in Charleston, but it was a Huguenot settlement, and so eventually they made their way up into the Green Bay area, which was a French Catholic area. And she was born in 1839. I'm talking about Elinor, and he was born in 1817. So if somebody wants to do a quick subtraction on that, you can get the difference in their ages. And they were married in, I think, 1857, 58, something like that. They had this young family, and I guess he did relatively well. At least they didn't live in poverty. And he died as a result of the Peshtigo fire. He was a casualty of the Peshtigo fire in this sense. This was a terrible fire that just devastated that whole part of Wisconsin. In 1871, it started on the same day as the Chicago fire, but never had the publicity. In the first place, there was not as much money up in the Peshtigo area. It was mostly a loss of life. And in this terrible fire, his wife's sister and her husband and their 5 children were all burned to death. And it was his grisly job to go up after the fire was over and pick up the remains and take them back and arrange for a Catholic burial. And now the rains had come, which had helped to put out the fire. And at the funeral service, he must have been under a lot of stress. At any rate, he took this terrible cold and developed into pneumonia, and he was dead within a week. And he left this poverty-stricken little family. And my father, he used to entertain us. In fact, we got awfully tired of hearing about how poor he had been as a little boy. You know, eat everything that's on your plate because you don't know how hungry I used to get when I was a kid. Now, this was the house, which is still standing in Okata, Wisconsin, where Pierre was born. I guess this is where the little family lived. And as you can see, we did not live exactly in what you'd call the lap of luxury. Oh, let me go back a slide. After he died in 1871, his mother was left with the task of bringing up all these children. And so she eventually got the two girls in a convent, and they both became nuns. The oldest son, Antoine, was quite a successful merchant, and then there was my father, and then there was another young son, John. And then eventually she entered a convent, and she was in a Carmelite monastery in Wilmington, New Jersey. She didn't die until I was grown, and I never laid eyes on her. My father used to go and see her once a year, and he'd have the privilege of talking to her for 15 minutes through a wicket. So there wasn't much of a relationship there between the grandmother and the children. Now we're back to my mother's side of the family. This is my mother at the top of the picture, Ella, and Mary Bird is at the left-hand side, and her mother, Sarah Allen, at the right-hand side. You've all heard me talk in the family about, she never approved of my mother's marriage. She never liked I'm talking about Nanny Bird. She never accepted my father. She always felt that my mother buried beneath her, so to speak. But when I'd gotten older and more mellow, that's one of the advantages of getting older, you do get more mellow. Why, I came to realize that she had a lot of problems herself. As I indicated to you, she was very spoiled because she was the only child of these well-to-do parents. And when she was 27 years old, now just think of this, when she was 27 years old, in the space of 3 months, her husband died, her 18-month-old child died, and she had a new baby in 3 months' time. So anybody that could survive that would have to be a pretty strong character. Now this is Pierre, P.A., Foxy Pete, as he later became known, probably about the time he went off to Notre Dame. He had been brought up, as I say, in this really impoverished family, but with these tales of glory, you know, being at the French court, and knowing Eugenie and knowing Napoleon, and they really, although they were poor, they felt they were part of the French aristocracy. A lot of it was in the grandmother's imagination, let me say, but anyway, they were brought up with that belief that they were really somebody. When Pierre had to go to work. He went to work when he was 10 years old, and he used to entertain us too with the stories of how brutal the man was that he worked for. I guess times were kind of tough in those days. At any rate, when he was a young lad in his teens, he ran away. He thought he couldn't stand with the conditions at home. He didn't want to be a burden to his mother, and he ran away out west. And now we're talking about in the 1880s. And for a period of a couple of years, his mother had not the slightest idea where he was. He had no communication with home at all. He'd gone out there with the idea of joining the army because, as I say, he'd been brought up on all these stories of Napoleonic glory. But he met a young army man out in the West who dissuaded him because he said the conditions on the West were really just awful. So he was trying to make his way out there, and he served as a cook on a steamboat out there on the Missouri River, and he loved to tell the story about how he had a fight with a Chinese cook one night, and the cook knocked him over the head with a frying pan, knocked him off the boat, and he swam to shore, and then in Chouteau, Montana, why he became a hotel clerk. And there he had a young friend they were quite good friends, and finally came in to Pierre one time, Pete as they always called him, and talked about having discovered gold in the Dakotas, and why didn't they go out there and try and find their own gold. Now remember, he's only about 15 or 16 years old. So Pete thinks this is a pretty good idea too. So they get on their horses, and this was when the West that has been immortalized in the movies and immortalized by Charles Russell and Remington. This was that Wild West. And so they got on their horses and were making their way to South Dakota by Pierre and this friend of his. They were joined by the friend's brother, and he decided he wanted to go along too. And they hadn't gone very far when they heard this group of men approaching from the rear on their horseback, and they didn't realize, I guess, the danger. At any rate, they stopped and waited for them, and it was a posse who had found a murdered Englishman in the Yellowstone Park area that the brother had been the guide for, and he was accused of his murder, and without much ado, you know, this was a kangaroo courts in those days, they strung up the brother. And my father's friend, Pete's friend, tried to save his brother, and they strung him up too. And the only thing that saved Pete's life was the fact that he was just a kid. He was 16 years old, 15 or 16 years old. And it did frighten him. He was really, literally scared to death. And so he made his way to the nearest telegraph office and telegraphed home and asked them to please send him money to get on home. So this later became a famous story in the Oxbow incident. I'm sure some of you know it. The circumstances of the innocent ones being hanged too, although in that story Pete got hung too. But at any rate, he went back home. I remember he had left school just almost in grade school, so he was tutored by the village priest, and he went to Notre Dame, and by that time his brother was successful enough to help him pay his way, and from there he had gone to Madison to enter law school, and it was there that he and my mother met. Nanny had a rooming house there for students, and Pierre was one of the roomers. And he and my mother fell in love, and Nanny Bird was violently opposed to this marriage. And finally they sneaked off and got married, and to prevent her being taken down to Florida, which was her mother's plan to break up this marriage. Nanny Bird broke up several marriages that could have been much happier than what eventually resulted. Her idea was money, position, and family. But at any rate, after Pierre finished his degree, got his degree at the University of Wisconsin, they went up to O'Connor, Wisconsin, and he was district attorney there for a while, and then eventually they moved to Marinette. In 1896, they moved to Marinette. And this was Ella, I would say, at the peak of her beauty. She really was a beautiful young woman, as you can see, and this was taken just the year before she was married. Now this is Nanny Bird, and this was taken outside of the house at Sun Prairie, and she was going to a costume party as there was a very popular story then. It was written by Wilkie Collins called The Woman in White, and she was going as the Woman in White. But this is a famous photograph of the family, because at that time Nanny Bird was very interested in spiritualism, and she was always conjuring up a ghost or two, and she was always great on table tipping and all, and she always thought the figure on the right-hand side of the picture was one of the spirits trying to communicate with her. So that was always a rather well-known picture in the family. This was Nanny and her ghost. Now, actually, Pierre and Ella lived very briefly in St. Louis, Missouri. He had a partnership with a man there. Too bad he didn't stay, because the partner later on became very famous. But there was a tornado in St. Louis in 1896, which was absolutely devastating, and it frightened them both so. And they were so far away from home that they came back and went to Marinette and bought this house in 1896, and this is where they lived until 1916. It was on State Street, across the street from where his son, Bird, we always called him Bird. People from outside always said, and what's his name? Bird? And how do you spell it? B-I-R-D. And then there's always this strange look in their face. So you had to be connected to the family to think it was an all right name. But at any rate, when we were moving in 1916, Dad wanted greener pastures. He was very successful, and it's too bad as a lawyer, and it's too bad in a short space of time, there isn't time to tell about some of his wonderful cases. You know, that he was kind of an early Perry Mason. He had a way of going around and around to what he was trying to get at, and then he would zero in and clinch his case, and for this he became known as Foxy Pete, up one side of Wisconsin and down the other. But he wanted to try his talents in larger climes, and so he had arranged for a partnership in Akron, Ohio, and this is when we left this house. And I think it might be of some interest, especially to the younger people. He went on ahead. The house was sold, and it was torn down to make extra room for the very rich people that lived on either side of it. And so my father went on ahead, and so Mother started out with these three devils in the back seat. My brother Pierre, my brother Jim, and myself. And it took us, and she was sitting up in the front seat with a chauffeur. She didn't know how to drive. She never learned how to drive. And it took us one solid day to go 65 miles with these kids fighting. It took us almost 2 weeks to get to Akron, Ohio. I really don't know how our nerves stood it. But anyway, this was the original house that we lived in that period of time. Pierre and Ella had two families. They had Eugene Bird, the grandfather of Jeff, father of Tina, was born in 1891. And this is Paul, the second son, who was born in 1893, and he died in 1903, 10 years old, probably of polio. And it was a terrible grief that neither my father or mother ever recovered from. And this was a little portrait of the little boy, and I think it's now in the family of Jean Martineau. But after this child died, and then they had a little girl, Mary Lenore, but after this child died, as so many people do who had lost a child, wanted to replace the child, and so they had started another family. And this is the Pierre Martineau, Jr., I guess you'd call him, and this is just after he was born. This was taken by a photographer in Marinette, and it was sent into a magazine and won a national prize. It hasn't stood the test of time very well, but this is his brand little newborn baby, just of the beginning of the second family. Then they wanted a companion for him, so they thought they should have another child. So this was Jimmy, who was born in 1906. And in 1907, they took these tents. This was before, hardly anybody had inside toilets. Everything was outside toilets or chamber pots. There was no cooking gas stove, and people weren't as complaining about the amenities, and so it was really quite a fashionable thing to go out to a nice resort and have a tent like we had here where we lived. And you see, it was two tents, probably fairly commodious. And so here are the two new babies. This is Pierre being with Mary, who is a little girl on the left, and this is Jimmy with the nursemaid. And so they finally ended up with the three. I was a mistake. My father went to Europe in the summer of 1908. He arrived home in September 1908, and I was born in June of 1909. So it was always said in the family I was a little French girl that he brought home from Paris because I was dark and looked a little French. But here we are. Pierre, born in 1905, Jim born in 1906, and I was born in 1909. And I have regaled my children for years with how these boys just picked on me. You can't believe how they picked on me. You can't believe how hideous they made my childhood. It's really strange that I'm as normal as I am. But one of the stories that's come down in the family is that I had these godparents, Mr. and Mrs. Madigan, and they didn't have much truck with these two older boys because they were so awful acting, but they were very nice to me. And they owned the vaudeville and movie theater at that time. Movies were just coming in. They were not much better than slides are today. And so they asked me to go to the Sunday afternoon show with them. So my brothers were furious about the fact that they weren't invited to. And I had this little astrakhan muff that I have there, and this little hat that I have on. And off I went to the show with Mr. and Mrs. Madigan. And so Dell, who was kind of fussy, she looked at the smell got to be just awful. And Dell looked back, and she'd go a sniff, and she'd look back there, and then finally she said, "Damn, those men in the back of it smell just terrible." So he went and got the usher, and he put them out. Well, the smell continued, and those awful brothers of mine, those terrible brothers of mine, had smeared the little flour with on my muff with Limburger cheese, and then they had put Limburger cheese all around the little ruff of their hat. And then when we got in the movie theater, in the show, and it got hot, the stench apparently was just unbelievable. But there we were in all our glory. Now this was Mary, I suppose about 14 or 15 years old. She was a beautiful girl, and she looked so much like my father, like my mother, and she was very placid like my mother and had the most wonderful giggle that my father just absolutely idolized her. And she had a lot of problems with this giggle. She was kicked out of every school in Marinette and finally ended up with a very strict convent down in, there wasn't anything, she didn't do anything that was bad, she just laughed all the time. And finally, they sent her away to this boarding school down in South Bend, Indiana, the Sisters of the Notre Dame. She was a wonderful sister. Now, this is Uncle Maury, my mother's brother, and Mary, and myself in a parade in 1914. I was about 5 years old, and that was one of the first automobiles in Marinette. That really caused a lot of commotion when it drove down the street. It frightened all the horses, and everybody turned around to look. And this is how Uncle Maury, who was a doctor, made his calls. He finally left his horse and buggy behind and went for one of those newfangled automobiles. And this was in the Marinette Eagle Star not too long ago. I mean, like 5 or 6 years ago. It didn't identify the people, but Jimmy recognized it, and he cut it out and sent it to me. Now, this is PA at the peak of his success. This was before he moved to Akron. This is about 1915. And as I say, he was kind of a early Perry Mason. And he really and truly was famous all over the state of Wisconsin for his trials, which always had a queer twist to them. The unfortunate part about it is he was a successful lawyer, but he was an unsuccessful author. His one dream in life was to be published, to be a published author. And he wrote a number of stories, and actually they were pretty good. But being up in this little small town, far away from the publishing world, he didn't know much about editors, he didn't know anything about the publishing business. He'd send off these manuscripts, and he would be so excited and so filled with anticipation, you know, and finally the manuscript would come back with a little brief letter that it was not acceptable. And I would say it was one of the sorrows of his life, that he didn't have anything published. And I suppose that's why both my brother Pierre and I, who have had published books, wished that he were alive, at least to have seen that we had some success. This was a picture that my father had developed after my mother died. My mother died in 1943, and he had found this picture, and he had it developed, and he sent it to each one of the children, because this is the way he remembered her at what he thought was the peak of her beauty. Now, this was taken about 1914 or 15, somewhere along in there. And these are their 5 children, the 5 children that live. On the far left-hand side is Mary, and then Eugene Bird, who was their oldest child, and then Pierre, and then myself, Eleanor, and then Jim on the far left. Mary married Sam Edgerton and moved to the east. Bird was an attorney in Marinette all these years. Pierre became really very famous in the advertising world. He's one of the founders of the motivation advertising field, and he wrote a textbook that was used he wrote a book that was used as a textbook in many universities and colleges that taught advertising for a long time. And then Jim, as you know, became a circuit judge, a lawyer and a circuit judge. Now, this is Bird and Martina on their honeymoon. Bird married Martina Ambuel, an Evanston girl. He went down, I don't know where he met her. I think he went to Northwestern and he met her, and then eventually finished at the University of Chicago. He got his law degree from the University of Chicago. And this was taken on their honeymoon when they went, 1915, I believe it was, and they went down to Florida and stayed at the estate of my mother's brother, Victor, on the St. John River. Victor made a career of marrying rich women, and he did have a beautiful estate on the St. John's River. It really was a beautiful place, and he gave it to Bird and Martina to use on their honeymoon. Weren't they a handsome pair? Martina was really a beauty, and Bird was so good-looking. They were a good-looking pair, that's for sure. Now, this is the house that Pierre and Ella bought when they came back to Marinette to live. We lived in Akron a very short time. He loathed it. He soon decided he was not a big city guy. And so we came back to Green Bay, and we lived there for a year and a half. And all this time, instead of trying to practice law, he was writing these stories of his. And finally, I think the whole time he was there, he didn't have a single client. And but we lived all right, because he owned some property that I guess kept the family alive. In fact, I had no sense of any sense of impoverishment, or that my father was hard up. But we came back to Marinette in 1919, and he bought this house. He and my mother bought this house up on Riverside, which is known as the old family home amongst all of us now. It had been built in the 1890s, 1896, by a very rich lumberman by the name of Louis McAlpin. And the house was built really to last, and because it was built by a lumberman, only the very finest materials were used inside, those great enormous doors that separated the various rooms, which some of you may remember. But at any rate, it was a house that a lot of us, older generation at least, have a lot of fond memories for. And one of the things that was so wonderful about this house is the view that you had looking up the river. This is the living room where the little bay comes out, and there was a great big bay window that looked up the river. And the house is kind of on a bend, so you got the full sweep of the river. The most glorious sunsets I have ever seen in my entire life. Any sunset I've seen, you know, they rave about the sunsets on the Italian lakes, which I've seen, and the sunsets on the Alps, which I've seen. Nothing was ever more beautiful than the sunset that we used to get out of the living room window up in Marinette. I had a curious experience a few years ago. I was giving a lecture for a group, and I was talking about old houses, and they had decorated the tables with these little china houses that are about a foot high, in various types of houses. They're modern houses and old-fashioned houses and Gothic houses and so forth. And at the table at which I sat, there was the exact replica of this house. And my heart jumped into my throat, and I said, "Wherever did you get this?" And they told me the shop that had loaned it to them. And I went to the phone and called up, and they let me buy it right off the table. And those of you who've been to our house during the holidays know what I'm talking about. This, when I was a child, this is a fairly recent picture, but when I was a child, this lawn area that you see used to be the tennis courts. And my father tried awfully hard to get us all to speak French. None of us, he didn't succeed, and he tried hard to get us all to learn how to play tennis, and none of us could do that. Now, this was taken in 1932. It was the last time my mother and father had all the family together. Jeff, do you want to stop a minute? This was taken summer of 1932, the last summer that my mother and father had all the family together. Pierre and Lenore, who were in the back row, used to come up every summer from Memphis, where he worked for the press scimitar with Lenore. And at that time, he only had the one little girl, who was Jackie, sitting at the front at my knee, so to speak. I don't think I should take the time to identify all these people. Or should I? We're talking about something going down through the ages. On the far left, Louise is in the back, Louise Martineau, and Jim, her husband, in the front. Bird Jr. is in back of my mother, and then Marjorie Edgerton is at her feet. Then Martina Ambule, Phil, Sis, which we always called her then, and little Jimmy. Then Bird and myself and Jackie Martineau, Pierre and Lenore's little girl. And then Lenore and Pierre and Sam Edgerton, Mary's husband, in the front row with my father, Pierre, and Sammy Edgerton and Mary. Now, I'm going to show you now a few pictures of the individual families. There is Bird and Martina and their family, and of course, on the far left is that darling little Tina, and then her two handsome brothers, Phil and Bird. And this was taken, I presume, about, 1934 or 5, something like that. Tina, you look about 4 years old. Maybe it was a little earlier than that, maybe more. Maybe a little earlier than that, maybe about 1930, 31. Now, this is Pierre and his little boy, Pierre Jr. Pierre and Lenore ran off and got married in college. He was, I think, a sophomore. He was a junior and she was a sophomore. And Sam Edgerton helped to get him a job down in Memphis, and he embarked on a newspaper career. And he was quite a brilliant man. In fact, there's been a biography of him written not too long ago. It's been published about his career in the advertising business. And this was taken up in Marinette, where they came every summer. He eventually went to the Chicago Tribune, where he was their advertising director. And that is where he got into this motivational advertising idea and helped to develop it. Among advertising, I still meet people. He died in 1964, I believe, and I still meet people who say, "Oh, you're Pierre Martineau's sister," and they fall down dead. Now, Mary used to come up to Marinette every summer, too. She and Sam had a cottage at Oakwood, and they would come up every summer. And so there we have my father and mother and Mary, Marjorie Edgerton, her little girl, Tina, and look how happy Sam Edgerton looks. Isn't that wonderful? Boy, he was sure meant. The funny part of it is that Sam Edgerton now, who is teaches art history, he's in charge of the graduate program at Williams College in Williamstown, and he too is quite well known in the art world and has had a number of books published. And this last book, which he had published about a year ago, he was kind enough to send me a copy, and he looked so much like Pierre, my brother, that it's just startling. We're just overwhelmed when we look at it. And I wish that I'd been able to produce those two pictures because you could see how much they look alike. Ted Martineau, Jim's son, called me one day and he said, "Have you seen that picture of Sam Edgerton?" And I said, "Yes, he looks just like Uncle Pierre." And so he does. Mm-hmm. Now, Charlie and I were married in 1932. I don't know why we blocked poor Charlie out there. He's such a handsome guy. But at any rate, right down the middle, he's crossed out. But 1936, you know, I feel sorry for all these in-laws of the Martineaus. You know, so they really have a tough time. And Charlie had kind of kept away from Marinette because he never really got the family all straightened out anyway. But in 1936, I prevailed upon him to drive up there. I would go home every summer, but I finally got him up there in 1936. And when Mother got the family together, the first thing she'd do is get on the phone to Uncle Maury and say, "Let's have a picnic." And so, and to Martina. And so Martina would bring the scallop potatoes, Mother would bring the meatloaf, and Uncle Maury would get the watermelon and put it in the lake to chill off, and we would all gather. This is 1938, 39, and I've come home for my first visit with our oldest child, Dennis we called her then, and there of course is Louise, and on my right is Jimmy Martineau, Jim and Louise's oldest son, who was born I think in 1929, and then there's myself and Dennis, and then little Ted, and then Pete in front of Louise. This is Jackie Martineau, here Eleanor's oldest child, and this is their little boy, Peary. Let me tell you a strange story about this. This is 1992. Denise, I'm out in Bozeman, Montana with Denise and Bill visiting their son, Charlie, who's out at Montana State. And Bozeman's a fairly large town, a fairly good-sized town, and we're walking down the street, and Denise said, "Here comes Peary Martineau." And sure enough, here comes Peary Martineau. He lives in West Yellowstone now, and they were in Bozeman for the day, and we walked down the street and bumped into each other. Sugar lives in, we always called her Sugar Jackie, lives in Manly, Iowa. Still does. Now, this is a family reunion, either Christmas or New Year's, about 1939, 1940, something like that. And Sam and Mary had come home for the holidays. It's the only time they ever came in the wintertime for the holidays. This is my father, Pierre, Foxy Pete, on the far left, Avis Bird, Uncle Maury's wife, Sam Edgerton, who was advertising manager in the Fat Cat days for the Saturdays and the Post, and of course Ella, and then Bird, as we always called him, still do. This is still part of this family gathering, Uncle Maury and Mary and Sam Edgerton, Jr. And this is Bird and Gladys, and I think this was just before they were married. They have that beatific look on their face that young people in love do, and they had come up for that occasion too. And somebody had just told a good joke. My father told wonderful stories. I don't know whether it was his story or not, but he told wonderful stories. And so as you can see, he's got Avis and Martino in gales of laughter. And these are, there's Sam Edgerton, Margie, and Tina. This is Judge James Martineau's proudest moment, 1960. Jack Kennedy then is still not been elected president, and he's up in Wisconsin. And Jim became very prominent in the Legion affairs up in Wisconsin, and I think he was state commander. And so Kennedy was up there hustling for votes, and Jim was very pleased, especially afterwards. He was a great Kennedy admirer. They have his picture taken with the famous Jack. Now this is a family reunion in 1974. Uncle Maury had died several years before that. Aunt Avis had died. And so the piece de resistance of that whole family reunion was dividing up what was in Aunt Avis and Uncle Maury's house. But as in this past reunion, 1992, we were ensconced at the Dome and down there on this little tiny beach. And there you see my husband Charles, Denise, Ted Martineau, excuse me. And this is the Morrison, Beth Morrison. And I don't know who the people are in the background. The only picture we have of Ted, he called me when I was getting these pictures together for this show, and I wish that he had sent me one of him and his present wife Sharon taken in Tibet. That was a pretty good picture, but we didn't think about it at the time when we were talking. Now, as I say, the piece de resistance of that particular reunion was dividing up the Uncle Maury and Aunt Avis's house. And Aunt Avis had left me a ring, and we couldn't find the ring. We looked. I made a special trip up to Marinette to look for the ring. We went through everything in the house looking for the ring. We couldn't find the ring. And that was all I was leaving for. She left Mary Martineau $10,000. She left my sister $10,000. All she left me was this ring. And we really spent a lot of time looking for it. Well, anyway, we gathered for this family reunion. We'd been looking for it for 6 or 7 months anyway. And Mary Martineau found it that afternoon in a drawer that I'd been through 6 dozen times, I thought. But anyway, it appeared that day. And as you can see, I was jubilant. But I later sold the ring. I never had any happy memories about it. And I later sold the ring at Southby's and used the money for something that I did enjoy. Now, Jim and Louise gave a cocktail party for that particular reunion. And so we are gathered at their house. And there is Jim, and in the background is Sally Martineau, Jim Martineau Jr.'s wife, and then Lou Morrison, Marjorie Edgerton's husband, and my Charles. And here is Jackie Martineau's, Herzog's husband. This is her husband, Fred, and Bird, the eldest of the children. And Fred is a dentist in Manly, Iowa. Really nice guy and a real feeling for the Martineaus. He and Jackie have come back almost every summer to Marinette to go out to her mother and father's grave and to go by the old house. And he seems to enjoy it as much as she does. Now, this is my family, and the reason I'm taking this not so much to show my family is to show you the view up the river. And this is the only view I have up the river. So this is Michael, of course, on the far right, and his wife Sandy, and Christopher Coyle, his youngest child with Mary, his first wife, and then David Headley, Denise's son, Denise and Bill's son. Now I'm just showing you this briefly. There are the Coyle grandchildren. And several of them are here today. There's Tom and Ted and Christopher and David. And in the front we have Kitty, who introduced me, Claire, who's presently working for a congressman in Washington, and then Charlie, who is out at Montana State. Now this was the 1980 reunion. And one of the reasons that I showed that is because some of the children, a couple of the children that have died this past couple of years are in this. One is Catherine Martineau up by her father, the fifth one from the left, and then John Martineau, who is standing down on a stool down at the very far right. And then up in the front are the only pictures I have of Pierre's older children, Pierre Jr. and Cherie, as we call her now, who lives out in California. And I guess that's all I can identify. Phil Martineau is up there sitting next to Louise, and I think that's all I have of him. Now, we were going to try, Jeff and I went over these pictures a lot, trying to decide how to bring this to a conclusion, and we thought we would try to identify some of the descendants with the people from whom they were descended. This is Bird and Martina. After my father died, he left the house on Riverside to Bird and Martina, and they sold the house on State Street and moved over here. And so this is taken in front of the river at 2543 Riverside. This was a picture taken down in Florida where Bird and Gladys eventually moved. This is Jean, that we call now. They dropped the Bird because it was confusing for people that didn't know about Bird being a family name. And he and Gladys moved down to Florida when he retired. So there we have Jean. We have Jack Cow, Tina's husband. We have Jo Ellen, Phil's second wife. We have Gladys Martineau, Jean's wife, and Tina and Phil. Those are Bird and Martino's children. Now this is Jean and Gladys's 50th wedding anniversary, and you can see they produced well too. And I really can't identify all those people because I don't know them all. There's Steve Martineau is a lawyer in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, and is the gentleman on the far left, and it's his wife in front of him, Debbie. And next to him, I'm not sure, I suppose one of their daughters. Over on the left-hand side is Jean Martineau and his wife, Catherine, I believe her name is. They live in New York. And Claire is in the background just over her father, and that's her husband, Perry, and I guess the rest are just some of the grandchildren. Now here are Tina and Jack's family. See, I have nothing of Phil's family. Phil is not very well right now, and he didn't send any pictures of his children or of his family. So we really have nothing but the ones I showed you. But anyway, here's Tina, and there's her handsome Jack right in back of her. And then we have, alongside of Jack, on the right-hand side, we have Jeff, who is doing all of this for us. And then in front of him is his beautiful wife, Sue, and his cute little girl, Dana. And then on the left-hand side, we have David and his wife, Rebecca. She works for the environment, I believe, down in one of the South American countries, and he has some kind of a government job for the environment too, I believe. I'm not too sure about that, but at any rate, that's close enough. And here we have the Cowks. Jeff didn't want to put this in. I insisted. I stamped my foot and I said, we must put this picture in because it's such a wonderful picture of all of them. You can see why Jeff has done so well in the photography world, can't you? But anyway, here we have Jeff and Sue and Dana, all dressed up for some big event. Now, this is all we have of Mary's family. I didn't hear from Sam, and so we don't have his. Sam, as I say, teaches at Williamstown, and he has 3 children. One of his sons died, and he has a son, Sam Jr., who lives out in California, and then he has 2 daughters that live in the East. But this is Marjorie Edgerton Moritzon's family, and that's her husband, Lou, and back, and a nicer guy never lived. And back of Marjorie is Diane, Jeff's wife. And then his other children I'm not too sure of. I hate leaving it like that. I really feel a terrible loss leaving like that, but I guess that's Beth in front with her 2 little girls. She was at the reunion this summer. And then in the back, the guy with the beard is their oldest son, David. And I'm not sure who, oh, that must be Beth's husband. And that's the best I can do for you. Now, this was the picture that Jackie sent of her family. And as I say, Jackie and Fred live in Manly, Iowa. In front of her, on her left-hand side, is their oldest daughter, Linda, who was exactly the same age as her aunt. Pierre and Lenore had a late baby, Cherie, and she and Linda were the same age and awfully good friends. And then Heidi is the young lady on the right, and then, of course, Fred in back of Jackie, and then their son David. Now this was from Jim's side of the family. This is Jim Martineau. He isn't Jim Martineau Jr., but it's easier to identify him that way. And his wife, Sally, they've lived in Minneapolis ever since they've been married. Sally was a Minneapolis girl, and so when Jim graduated from Amherst, I believe it was. They moved out there. And there are his three children. Catherine is the one on the left-hand side who died this last year very unexpectedly. And then Jimmy. These children are all grown. Remember, we're talking about, this picture must be at least 20 years old. And then on the far right is a little Helen Claire who works for a publishing company in Boston. Now, this is Pete Martineau and his family, and I called up Pete and I said, just one picture per family. And so this is what he sent us. And this is, Mona is the girl that he is embracing on his right, and then are his four daughters. And Belinda, who is the one standing in the back. No, I guess Belinda's on the one in the red. She's quite a famous scientist, and this last year I was taking a trip, and I picked up an American, naturally, because of Michael working for American, and I picked up a magazine. There was an article about this new tomato that's being developed that's going to last longer on the vine, so when we get tomatoes in the wintertime, they aren't going to taste like Excelsior. And it was all about Belinda and what she's doing with it. Apparently, she's well recognized in her family. And the other four daughters, they kept trying for a son, and they never had any luck. So they finally ended up with these four, really you'd call very handsome daughters. Can that get focused a little better? Okay. This is taken at the family reunion that we had up in Marinette in 1992 this summer. And this is Charlie and me with our brood. And I can identify all these, thank goodness. And in the back is Tom, our oldest grandson, and Chuck Ryerson, Kitty's husband, Bill Headley, Denise's husband, and David and Mike, our son, and Charlie Headley, the boy that's out at Montana. The second row is Katie and their new baby, Elizabeth, and Erica, Charlie and Chuck, he hates it when I call him Charlie, Chuck Ryerson's daughter, Erica, and Claire, and Kitty, and Claire, and then Denise, and then Charlie and Julie, Ted's wife, and then Deb Headley and their little girl, Anna. And then in the front row, we have none other than Scott Coyle, who is here applauding all this, and Michelle, who's also here today, and little Michael 2 we call him, and then myself, and then Tyler, who's here today, and Ted, and their new baby, little Nicholas. Now, the reason I'm showing this picture, this was taken maybe 4 years ago, and Charlie and I were over in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, and we were going down to South Carolina on a visit with Katie and Tom. And I showed you those pictures of, the long hair bit, and I'm doing this so that you won't get discouraged with your adolescent's behavior, how they act at 16. I thought Tom now is very much the successful young businessman, very handsome young guy, and you never know how they're going to turn out, do you? And there is Katie holding Scott. He's just a young baby at that time, and little Michael. But that picture is mostly to show you, to give you all hope. And this is Ted, our second grandson, with Julie, his wife, and little Tyler. And now there's since a new little boy to that family, little Nicholas, and you saw his picture on that previous one. And this is Charlie and Deb and little Anna, who is certainly the apple of their eye, and Kitty. I've got Kitties and Katies, and I've got so many I have a hard time keeping all these names straight from time to time. But anyway, for Christmas that year, Kitty had made these little matching outfits, and they were very becoming to both. This is the wedding that took place in March 1989 of Kitty and Chuck Ryerson and little Erica. And it was a very beautiful wedding and a very handsome couple, as you can see. And here's David Headley. This is 1992. He's presently in college down in Florida. And this is Claire, who is working for the congressman from New Jersey in Washington, and very much in the political life in Washington. It's fun to talk to Claire. You kind of feel like you're in the know after you've talked to her, because she's there at the seat of some of the power at any rate. And Jeff and I didn't know how to finish this, so we finally decided we'd finish it with this picture of Charlie and me out in New Mexico, where we went a year ago with Mike and his son Matthew, and this was taken in front of this very famous church, Rancho de Taos, and I don't know why we thought this was a good picture to end it up with, except that I'm the one that's doing the narration, and this is my handsome husband. But I hope you've kind of enjoyed it. I hope I haven't gone on too long. I get started, it's hard for me to stop. But I wonder, are there any questions from anybody? Would anybody like to ask anything about some of these family stories? To tell you the story about my father's ancestry, which has always been something of a mystery. I gave you a little brief rundown of it, but at any rate, after we're talking about my father's grandfather, Pierre Burgoyne. He was the one who quarreled with his father and came to the New World and married this young Santo Domingo girl whom he met in Cuba. Her family had lost everything in the revolution, uprising of the slaves, and their lives had been saved by a slave who helped them escape to Cuba with not very many of their possessions. After this quarrel that Pierre had with his father, he changed his name. He changed his name from what his father's name had been to Burgoyne. And we grew up with this story, but my father never knew how to spell it, whether it was Chevier or whether it was spelled with a CH or an S, and none of us could speak French. We really didn't know. And when my grandmother went into the convent, she took the name of Sister Marie Denise Chevier. She went back to her father's name, although she'd always been known as Burgoyne as a young girl. But just this last year, I had a cousin who sent me the Chevalier, Chevalier coat of arms, and she said, this is whom we're descended from. And I thought a little bit about that and pondered it, and I thought, why would Chevier be Chevalier? But now I've come across the fact that that is the way Chevalier is pronounced, is Chevier. So there may be a lot of basis to the fact that he was much higher up in the French government than we sometimes have thought. And let me say this, that the only reason that my grandmother ever did accept my father at all, you know, I can't tell you what a snob she was. I don't want to go into that because, as I say, I've gotten more mellow as the years have passed. But she and her youngest daughter, Sarah, went to Europe about 1903, and they did go through the tomb of Napoleon there, and she did find the picture of the man that my father claimed to be his great-grandfather. So she was somewhat mollified at that and accepted him more than she had previously. And I guess it was spelled Chevalier. So somebody who can speak French and who is interested in carrying on some of these family stories should be the one to investigate it.
So what about the Raconteur?
Oh, well, my father's grandmother's name was Angelique Gerard Burgoyne, as they now became known. And when they came over to the Green Bay area, I remember he had been brought up as a gentleman. He had no way of working with his hand. He didn't know what to do. And they were poor. I guess they'd carried some of their money off from Santo Domingo, that area. But at any rate, they were poor. He didn't know how to make a living, and he died at a very early age. And so they were left in an impoverished state. But old Angelique apparently was a wonderful storyteller. And she lived with my father's mother and family. And in these days, remember, there was no television, there wasn't a whole lot of reading material, there were no public libraries, there were no radio, there was nothing of that sort. And she was a wonderful storyteller, apparently. And people used to come, according to my father, from miles around to hear old Angelique tell these stories of the French court and Napoleon and the Empress Josephine, and I presume she embroidered them. But at any rate, this tradition of being a storyteller in the family, I presume at least dates back to her. But she held people enthralled, and I suppose how I've discovered in my own work that people too tend to embroider stories sometimes. So maybe he wasn't Napoleon's best friend, but apparently he was at the French court. Anything reminded me of things. My mother really was kidnapped by the gypsies when she was a little girl. And we were all brought up on that story, and that's the reason I was always so fearful about letting a child out of my sight. But after her father died, my mother's father, her grandfather, George Carmichael, had a place down in Florida, and it's called St. Nicholas. This is before South Florida was developed. This is the area around the Jacksonville area. This was just outside of Jacksonville. And it was kind of a fashionable little resort then, and they had this cottage there, or house there. And so my mother, they were taken down there, and she was, the young widow was trying to recover from her grief. And my mother, of course, was, I presume, felt terrible about losing her father. And she was playing out in the front of the yard, and these two, a man and a woman, came along, who later proved to be gypsies. And they stopped to talk to this little girl. And she told them about her father having just recently died. And they said, well, wouldn't you like to bring a present for your mother? Wouldn't you like to get some candy for your mother? So off she went with them. And this is the way gypsies used to replenish their tribe. And I guess maybe they still do. But the stories you hear about being kidnapped by the gypsies were not just a lot of idle chatter and just things that people tell their children, like the boogeyman, to frighten them. They really did kidnap children in those days. And they took her back to this camp where they were, and she was now missing for several days. But finally they sent her down to get some water near the spring nearby, and she had sense enough to run off, and did, and she got to the road, and she was standing there by the road crying. And a horse and buggy with a man and a woman came along, and they stopped. They noticed the little girl crying, and they stopped. And she told them who she was, that she was Ella Bird, and that these people had taken her away from her mother and father, and they knew that this child was missing. So they took her in the buggy with them and returned him to her mother. But the irony of the whole thing is they came back to try to get her. And but this time her mother was keeping a more careful watch on the situation. And so she said that she would call the authorities if they didn't leave and ever came back again. But that was also one of the stories that I was brought up on. And as I say, I've always been just scared to death to let any of my children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren, as it is now, out of my sight. Now, is there anything I've forgotten?
Seeing your brothers making your...
Well, I hope you've enjoyed it. At least Jeff and I, in making this, was his idea, but it was, when I'm gone, these stories are gone, because nobody else in the family has bothered to tell them to their children, tell them to their descendants. I'm never going to write them down. I'm never going to talk into a tape recorder, and this is it. And he thought it would be a wonderful idea to make this tape so that when I say for generations still unborn, it may be so. We hope this tape will be around a long, long time. Give all of those who watch it a sense of family and where you came from and what your roots were, and give you more of a sense of identity. You did come from some very early settlers in America. You came from also immigrant branch, because my father was only a second-generation American, first-generation American. So you do have a heritage that is something to be proud of.